Alrighty, good afternoon. My name is Megan Elliott. These are my colleagues, Lauren Loving, Carissa Weaver, and Maura Greff. The title of our study is seen up here. It's the effect of a targeted exercise regimen on hip and ankle range of motion in the squat position for dancers versus non-dancers. Next slide, please. All right, so here we have a graphic of our poster. Just gives you a little bit of an overview of what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to start with the introduction, then go through methods and materials, and then we're going to have our results and conclusion. Next slide, please.
We just want to thank the Dance Science program and all the dancers and non-dancers with their help and participation in our study, and we have no financial disclosures.
Next slide. All right, so our purpose for this study was to analyze the effects of a consistent workout regimen on ankle and hip mobility. And then a few reasons why we were interested in this topic are listed, and one of which is the aesthetic demands of dance. So as dancers, we always want to have a deeper plie, higher extensions, certain things that you must have a greater range of motion to achieve than the average individual. Another reason for this is lower back pain and injury. It's very, very common amongst dancers. And a few reasons for that can be tightness in the hips, as well as any misalignments in the ankle or feet. Because of the kinetic chain in the body, anything that's going on in the lower extremities can affect things in the upper body as well. And then lastly, also just the increase in jump power is something we considered. Ideally, a deeper plie would help you get higher in your jump. These two things are not things that we specifically studied, but were just some reasons as to why we were interested in ankle and hip mobility. And then our hypothesis was that by routinely incorporating strengthening and stretching exercises of the lower extremities, the hip and ankle range of motion could increase. Next slide.
So our methods and materials, we do have a few tests that we did for our pre and post test in order to get our results. The first test was the Thomas test, which shown in the bottom picture. It was basically a test that measures the flexibility and laxity of the hip flexor muscles. On your left, you can see what a positive test would look like, and on the right side, it's what a negative test would look like. Then we went to the weight-bearing lunge test, which is what the top picture is. And then that one basically measured the distance of the knee from the wall. And then we did a video analysis of the depth of the squat in comparison to the pre and post test. And then we also did an angle measurement of the hip and ankle joint in the squat position.
Next slide.
And then so our participants for the study were randomly assigned to two different groups. We had them assigned to a control group and an intervention group. Both the control and the intervention group did the warm-up exercises that you see above for the pre and post test. And then the control group just did with their normal everyday activities for the next 6 weeks before they came back for the post test. For the intervention group, we had them meet about twice a week for 6 weeks, and they did all of these intervention protocols. And then following that, they were like 15 to 20 minute sessions each, and they recorded themselves through a video and submitted it to us. That was found to be the easiest way for us to do it with everyone with COVID and the snowstorm. So that is what we stuck with for the whole submission process. And then on to the next slide.
So here are results. Our results are split into 4 groups. We have the dancer intervention group and dancer control group, and then non-dancer intervention group and non-dancer control group. As you can see on these graphs here, our ankle range of motion increased, mostly among dancers, but also a slight increase among our non-dancer intervention group as well. You can see that a decrease in the angle would show like an increase in range of motion because it's smaller, further away from 90 degrees. And so you can see on our graphs that the angle of all of our dancers increased regardless of if they were in the intervention group or the control group, but the dancers in the intervention group did increase slightly more than the dancers in the control. All of our dancers were in a ballet class, which meets 3 times a week here at our dance program. And so that could explain why all of the ankle range of motion increased. Next slide, please. And this is our hip range of motion. We found that all of our participants had negative Thomas test results, both in our pre-test and our post-test. This was not something we were anticipating. And I think it just was based on the individual participants that that ended up coming to our study. And so those results were not helpful in concluding hip range of motion. And in our hip ankle measurements, we found that there was no significant increase or decrease in hip range of motion throughout all of our participants. Next slide.
So in conclusion, we found that there is a correlation between the regimen and exercises we did with that increase of range of motion in your hip and ankle. But ultimately, it was the dance classes that really had the majority of effect and the most outcome with the results. With our normal day participants, they did not do anything that we know of. My roommates were a part of it, and I know they did not do any physical activity. So it really, all they were doing were those 2 a week regimens. Limitations on our study was definitely length. I think having it longer would have helped the normal participants, or ones that are not dancers, because that maybe having them do it 3 days a week, whatever it may be, that would definitely be beneficial. Video submissions were definitely not ideal, but it did work best with COVID-19 and the snowstorm and everything. So we did stick to that, but having them in person probably would have benefited us more in the long run. And lastly, that Thomas test result, as Carissa said, it really didn't benefit our results in any way. So having a different test to see that hip flexibility would have been better. And next slide. So in future result, we would like to have a similar study over a longer period of time. Some different population groups. We noticed that, of course, a lot of dancers had hypermobility, and we didn't really think about that before starting our interventions. So that would be something interesting to look into. Different types of dancers, whether it be hip hop, salsa, whatever, because every dance obviously has different use of your body. And then frequency of dance classes. Like we said, 3 times a week, maybe a studio, having them 5 days a week. How does that affect overall results? And then different exercises in the long run. Our intervention was 15-20 minutes. How would a longer one help, and what different exercises could possibly benefit and increase that range of motion in the long run? And then next slide. These are our references we used to research, and that is all we have. Thank you very much.
Howdy, my name is Grace Buckley. This is Naomi Noreen, Mercedes Rivera, and Brianne Patek, and we researched the effects of strengthening on preventing foot pronation in dancers. So at this time, you can go to the next slide. At this time, we have no financial disclosures. Next slide, please. So what is foot pronation? Pronation is when the weight of your body tends to favor the inside or the medial side of the foot, and then the arch tends to flatten out and the Achilles will angle inwards. So on our y'all's far left, you can see a pronated foot. All the weight is tending towards the arch. In the middle, we have a normal foot. So the tibia is sitting right on top of that calcaneus. And then on the right, we have a supinated foot. So the weight is actually going to tend to the outside of the foot or the lateral side. Next slide. So why is this important in the dance science field? This is important because developing ankle stability increases the ability for a dancer to perform and decreases the risk of injury. Pronation is one of the most common ankle misalignments in dancers, and it does cause a lot of injuries, specifically in landing from jumps. Pronation, the purpose of our study is when dancers pronate their feet, of course, it obviously causes a lot of injuries, and it can affect the entire kinetic chain up all the way through the body, specifically up into the hip. If the ankle is misaligned, it's easier for the knee and then the hip to experience those misalignments as well.
Next slide, please. And then for current research, we had two different studies that we cited. The first one was done in 2005, and they took 13 dancers and they wanted to analyze two things. They wanted to look at the biomechanics of a releve on point, and they also wanted to compare bilaterally what that looked like between those two ankles. They found that the non-dominant ankle had the same movement pattern as a dominant one, but there was a different joint moment. So this could mean that there's a possibility of each ankle playing a different but also important role in maintaining the dancer's balance and control. The second one was on augmented feedback, and this was done in 1986 by the University of Massachusetts. And they wanted to see if augmented feedback would be effective for helping dancers with ankle pronation. And they did find that it was effective. It helped them become more aware of it and treat their ankle pronation. Next slide. And then for the pre-testing, we had some requirements. So we had three. They had to be at least 18 years old. They had to be with the TAMU dance program. And they also needed to be free from any lower extremity injuries for the past 6 months. So we had a total of 8 participants, and they all did the same warm-up and the same pre-test. So for warm-up, they all sat in pike starting out, and they had a lot of reps of 10. So for the first exercise was a point in flex. Then they had ankle circles in and out, 10 reps each. And then they had to stand up and stand in first and do prances. And then releves, and they did the same thing in parallel. And then they moved on to 10 leg swings on each leg and then 20 échappés. As for the tests themselves, we had 3 of them. So they had the stork test, both with their eyes open and their eyes closed. And that was for balance. The single leg releve test to see how long they could go with correct ankle alignment before any pronation or wobbling. And then the star excursion test, which that is a diagram of it on the right. And so that's just the pattern that the dancers would be trying to follow with their working leg without any pronation in their standing leg. Next slide. So here's a little bit of visuals for that. That bottom one is actually what the star excursion test looks like. And we're looking at that standing leg for any pronation and to see how far that working leg can go before that foot starts pronating. That top left picture is essentially what the stork test looks like. The only difference is their arms will be crossed. And then that diagram on the right shows what that single leg releve looks like. Next slide.
So our total intervention time was 5 weeks. It should have been 6, but we had to shorten it for our winter storm. We had 4 intervention participants and 4 control participants. So the warm-up in this was the same as the pre-test warm-up. We did TheraBand work, point flex, inversion, eversion, circles for that. And then we also had balance work where we used the Bosu ball and had them do intervals of balance on those, just as kind of getting the dynamic systems as well as just strengthening. And after that, we did a cool down. So you just pinky ball the bottom of your feet and then did a arch stretch to end the intervention exercises. Next slide, please. So for our post-test, it was repetition of all the pre-tests and we recorded the changes in between. 1 intervention participant was excluded because of COVID-19. And next slide. So the results were 2 out of the 3 participants increased time in stork test with their eyes closed. The single leg releve decreased in all the participants, but this could have very well been just difference in the people who were watching them. If one person thought that the deviation in their ankle was okay and the other person didn't. So it could have been, the experimenter's choice on that one. And in the star excursion test, there was a decreased prevalence in pronation for all intervention participants. And the control stayed the same. They didn't see any increase. All right, next slide, please.
And here we have some graphs on some of the things that we've found in our study. We focused more on the eyes closed portion of the stork test because there was very little change, if any at all, with the eyes open stork test. We kind of know as dancers, it's really easy to balance with your eyes open. It's a little bit harder with your eyes closed. So that's kind of why we focused on that. On the left is the experiment, or on y'all's right, the experimental group. And then on y'all's left is the control group. And two out of the 3 experimental group participants increased their time. And then 2 out of the 4 control group increased their time in the eyes closed portion of the stork test. And the pronation, as we discussed in the previous slide, decreased out of the experimental group as a whole. Next slide. And then here are results for the single leg releve total. You can max out on each leg doing 25 releves. 2 out of the 3 participants increased their total releve total. And then 3 out of the 4 of the control group increased the total in the single leg releves. But as we again mentioned, the pronation was a lot less significant in the experimental group. Next slide. So here are our conclusions. We concluded that routine exercise will decrease prevalence in pronation during movement and weight-bearing exercises. However, we did see that there was little change in balancing when it came to pronation. And both groups, as we said, overall increased the number of single leg releves from pre-test to post-test. We did have some limitations in our study. So we initially had 8 participants, but like Mercedes said, we did lose one in our experimental group due to COVID. There were also multiple studies in the dance program going on at the same time, which could have skewed our results. And we also had the Texas winter storm. But in the future, we would like to increase the amount of time that we're doing this study, especially with losing a whole week to the winter storm. That definitely could have affected our results. And meeting more times throughout the week, we think would increase our data and help us come to a better conclusion. And then next slide. These are just our references on what we used in this study. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Amanda Reeder, and this is my colleague, Janine Quast. And today we are presenting our research on knee hyperextension control. Could you go to the next slide? So this is the poster that we made for our presentation. It gives a general overview of all the stuff that we're going to be talking about today. All right, so can you go to the next slide? So this is our topic outline. So we're first going to go over an introduction real quick, some research that we referenced, materials, methods. We'll go into results, then a conclusion, some major takeaways and next steps, and then we'll end with our sources. So you can go to the next slide. So here we have the title of our research. The full title is The Effects of Muscle Strengthening on Knee Hyperextension Control in Collegiate Dancers, Popliteous versus Quadricep and Hamstrings. So the purpose of our study was really to examine the effectiveness of quadricep and hamstring strengthening versus popliteous muscle strengthening when it comes to the control of the hyperextension in the knee. So our hypothesis was that in strengthening the popliteous muscle, that was what we were going to see was going to have the most effect on control for the hyperextension. You can go to the next slide. Okay, so we're going to do a brief overview kind of the anatomy of the knee that is affected by hyperextension. So as you can see in the picture, you have 4 ligaments in your knee. The 2 that are most affected are the ACL and PCL, because when you're pushing back into your hyperextension, those are the 2 ligaments that you're pushing back on. And dancers with hyperextension have a lot more laxity in those 2 ligaments, which means there's less stability and less control of the knee joint. And then could you go to the next slide, please?
So these are the two muscle groups that we are looking at. On the left, you have the popliteous muscle, which is kind of small, but it crosses right behind the ligaments, which is why we were interested in it, because since it's directly behind it, we wanted to see if it would support the ligaments more. And then we compared that to quadriceps and hamstring strengthening, as we see in a lot of other exercises that you do for hyperextension control. Next slide.
So here we have a quote that we found really interesting. Treatment of this malposition of the knee in older adults should be considered as a priority. And we didn't really think that it was. So you can go ahead and go to the next slide. So here's a couple of studies that really impacted our research. So studies show that there is a huge importance when it comes to the popliteous muscle. So in one study, they actually took cadaver knees and they cut up different ligaments and such, and they found that when they severed the oblique popliteous ligament, it had the most effect on hyperextension. And then also hyperextension leads to injuries. So female athletes with knee hyperextension are 5 times more likely to injure their anterior cruciate ligament. Also, hyperextension is common. Approximately 38% of participants in this one study had patchy flexibility, and then 90% of those 38 had knee hyperextension issues. And then finally, proprioception plays a huge role. Findings report that the subjects that had hyperextension in their knees had poorer proprioceptive feedback than the controls did in that same study. You can go to the next slide.
Okay, so now we're going to talk about the materials that we used for this experiment. So we had a total of 6 participants, which is kind of small, but that the dance program is small, so that was kind of the number we fell at. There were 2 in each group, so we had 2 in control, 2 strengthening quads and hamstrings, and then 2 strengthening the popliteus muscle. Our intervention materials, we used weights, yoga pads, TheraBands, the studio. And then to measure, we used the goniometer, and we had 2 participants that participated fully online. So we used an angle meter app. The picture up in the top corner right here shows you kind of how that looked. And so you had to put the points on like your ASIS and your ankle and then the middle of the knee joint. And that's how we tracked their hyperextension throughout the study. And then obviously we had people on Zoom and in person. We had them fill out medical history forms and questionnaires that basically it was like a personal observation for them to see kind of how they tracked their progress over this experiment. And then next slide, please.
So this slide kind of describes the methods that we used in our experiment. So for pre and post test, they are basically the same. We started out with a warm up. Then we measured with the goniometer their hyperextension in parallel, then in flat back, and then in a one-legged penché on both the right and the left side. Then we finished off with a cool down to protect those hamstrings that we just warmed up. And then we had 2 intervention groups. As we've talked about, there's the popliteus group and the quad hamstring group. So both started out with the same warm up and ended with the same cool down. The difference being that the popliteus group had reverse heel taps, step task, and half squats. And the quadricep and hamstring group had squat jacks, glute bridges, one-legged deadlifts, and reverse lunges. So you can go ahead and go to the next slide. So after about 2.5 weeks, we decided to amp up the difficulty of these exercises because these are dancers and we need to challenge them. So in the popliteus group, in the reverse heel tap, we doubled repetitions from 5 to 10. We added 2 pounds weights to the half squats, and then we added an unstable surface in the form of a yoga pad for the step task. And then the quad hamstring group, we increased the reps for squat jacks from 10 to 15. We added 2-pound weights to the glute bridges. We increased the deadlift reps from 5 to 7, and then we added 2 pounds weights to the reverse lunges. You can go ahead and go to the next slide.
Okay, so this slide shows our results. The way we measured it was looking at the mean degree of change. So we took their results from the post-test minus the pre-test, divided that by the results from the pre-test, and then divided it by 100 to get the percent. And so that's what we got. The negative values for control, basically what this means, so they were cued throughout the entire testing process to not sink into their hyperextension. So the negative values in the control group show that in order to not sink into hyperextension, they overcompensated for that, which means they didn't gain the proprioception of like the control and stability in the knee joint like the other 2 groups did. And then the popliteous bars are higher because overall they had more control and more stability in that joint by the end of it. And while the quads and hamstrings still increased, they just didn't increase by as much. You can go to the next slide. So like I said, the dancers were compensating a lot in the control group, lacked the proprioception that the other groups did have. Another interesting thing that we saw was virtual versus in-person. So like I mentioned in the beginning, we had 2 participants that were fully online due to COVID. And one of those was in an intervention group, and her results did not improve by as much as the rest of the participants that did it in person. So that's one thing that we thought was interesting because it may have affected our data and how that looks on the bar graph. And then you can go to the next slide, please.
So we'll move on to some takeaways and some next steps. So we noticed some limitations in our study that we just talked about. The amount of participants is one, 6 really isn't large enough. And then we didn't have enough time really to see full potential. We were cut short with a week of snow. So our intervention was 5 weeks instead of 6. And even then I feel like it could have been longer. And then we didn't have everyone on the same platform due to COVID-19, having some virtual and some in person. So what we would change next time would be having more participants, a longer duration of intervention, more gradual increases in difficulty, and everyone using the same platform and equipment. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. So implementing this into our daily lives would be very easy, in my opinion. It only took about average of 10 minutes to do this intervention, warm up and cool down all together. Doing these exercises before each class, even 3 times a week, would really increase a hyperextended dancer's control of that hyperextension. And then further research, we did open up the question of what's the difference between virtual and in-person. And we realized that there's not a lot of study on hyperextension control at all. And not only can more research be done on the popliteous muscle, but also the difference between virtual and in-person learning. You can go ahead and go to the next slide.
Okay, so these next 2 slides are our sources that we used. So you can go ahead and go to the next one. This is the sources of the information from the research Janine shared earlier. And then next slide, please. Thank you all for listening, and we are now going to take questions.
Howdy, welcome to our presentation. I'm Maya Pepito.
And I'm Jessica Dykes, and we did a study on the effects of using video feedback on the performance of dancers at the collegiate level. And more specifically, we wanted to find out whether or not using the video feedback would improve performance during a ballet test phrase or in technique classes. Next slide, please. Here is a poster that we made that is basically an overview of all the things that we're going to go in depth talking about during this presentation. So we'll go into a lot of detail throughout the presentation about this poster. Okay, we would like to thank the Dance Science program at Texas A&M University for allowing us to conduct this research, and Carissa Armstrong for guiding us through the whole research process. Additionally, we have no financial disclosures associated with this study. The reason why we wanted to conduct this study was because as dancers, we are constantly getting feedback on how to perform certain skills better and improve our technique overall. Usually the feedback that we receive is just verbal or tactile feedback, which can be good at times, helping us in the moment on specific skills, but it can lose its effectiveness as we go through class or move on to different exercises. So we really wanted to see if video feedback alone could benefit performance of collegiate students, because it's not a form that we typically use very often in class. Dancers that participated in the study used only videos of themselves and gave themselves corrective feedback to try and improve their performance of ballet test phrases. And we'll take a look at those test phrases in just a minute. So when me and Maya were looking for studies to conduct research on, we were trying to figure out what we wanted to do. We found these studies that kind of inspired our research. The first one is a study done on video modeling coupled with video feedback, and it was done on a group of competitive dancers. But something that really sets the study apart from the research that we conducted was this study was done on one specific skill, a brise. And they ultimately concluded that the combination of video modeling and video feedback showed substantial improvement when they focused on one specific skill. So we wanted to see if using some of those elements that they used in that study would benefit dancers when doing the study on a whole test phrase. The next study was done on feedback that dancers gave themselves based on a mirror and then based on video. We all love having a mirror in class to make adjustments as we dance, but taking the mirror away during performances or on the stage can be jarring to a lot of dancers because they have never actually felt the adjustments in their body. They just go solely based on what they see in the mirror and fix themselves that way. This study found that the video feedback was a great way for dancers to see the adjustments and then get up and actually feel the adjustments in their body. And it translated a lot better to the stage and to performance when they used video feedback as opposed to using the mirror. And then the last study that inspired our research is very similar to our study that we're about to get into, but this one was done with a partner that gave verbal feedback along with the video feedback. So as you'll see, the big difference between this study and our study is that we didn't give any verbal feedback. We only gave the dancers the videos, and then they gave themselves corrective feedback based on what they saw. We hypothesized that if dancers are provided with video feedback of themselves performing specific technical skills, then it'll lead to an overall improvement in their performance on stage and in technique classes. So how exactly did we do this study? We conducted our study over the course of 5 weeks, and we started with 7 participants. Unfortunately, we're only able to use data from 6 of our participants because someone had to drop out in the middle of the study. Each participant was randomly assigned to one of 2 groups, either the intervention or experimental group or the control group. So we're going to interchange experimental and intervention group, but it's the same group. If a participant was assigned to that intervention group, they were asked to come 3 times a week to perform tasks that we collected the data from. And all the participants, no matter what group they were in, had to complete pre and post test. They were also aged 18 to 24 and enrolled in the TAMU dance program. So aside from just the videos that we took of the dancers, we also collected data from surveys that we had them do at pre and post testing, surveys that we did each intervention, and then Maya and I also did evaluations of their performance over the course of the study. To avoid improvement solely based on repetition of the test phrase, we came up with other phrases that we called mini phrases to kind of work on the skills in the test phrase, but we didn't want them to do the test phrase every single intervention. So Mondays we focused on pirouettes and an arabesque balance. Wednesdays we worked on transitional steps and grand jetés. And Fridays we worked on overall performance of the test phrase, so that was the only day out of the week that they did the test phrase. Each intervention had the same layout and order of events so that we could keep our consistency. So first we would have them watch the video from the same day last week. For example, if they came in on a Monday, we would show them the Monday video from the last week, and they would be given a survey to kind of rate their performance from 1 to 5. And we'll see a sample of the survey in just a second. After that, we would do a short warm-up, mark that mini phrase 1 or 2 times, video it, and then do a short cool down. Next slide. So here are those surveys that I was talking about. This is the survey done at each intervention at the very beginning. So depending on the day of the week, the survey would have you rate your performance for that skill of the day. So again, Mondays we focused on pirouettes and that arabesque balance. So participants would rate their performance of those skills based on the video from 1 to 5. And then there would be an open-ended question saying something like, what do you think you need to do in order to improve your pirouette or improve your arabesque balance? And then that would give the dancer something to focus on when they did the mini phrase this week. And hopefully, we were hoping that would lead to improvement in those skills. Next slide.
So like Jessica previously mentioned, all of our groups did a warm up and a cool down in the post testing and in the pre-testing, and then also at each intervention session. And so this is just kind of the layout of how the warm up and the cool down went. They would do this after they filled out their survey. So then they were given the opportunity to mark the phrase or mini phrase, depending on whichever day of the week it was, and then they would do the cool down to follow. Okay, so here we have a video of the test phrase just to give you an example of what it consisted of. And so that was our main phrase that we tested them on and that they learned in pre-testing. And then again, they repeated it during post-testing. And then if they were in the intervention groups, that's what they did on Fridays. And so some of the results that we found was that the visual feedback from the videos did demonstrate an increase in performance in the participants that were part of that intervention group. And we noticed this from our video data that we had from them that we could compare from their pre-testing to their post-testing. And in a second, we'll show you the graphs of our data showing how some of the dancers involved in that experimental group were able to increase their ratings on their performance, which were the ratings that Jessica and I gave them whenever we filled out the evaluations on their performance. And so some of them were able to increase their ratings by 1 and even some of them by 2 levels. And so it was interesting to see that the video feedback had such a tremendous impact because typically, as we previously mentioned, dancers hardly ever receive video feedback in a typical class setting. Usually it's just verbal feedback or tactile feedback, like Jessica discussed earlier. Okay, so to further demonstrate our results, we're going to show you some videos from our control group and our intervention group. So this first video is of a participant who is a part of the control group, and this is their pre-testing video on their left side. This is a video of that same individual from their post-testing. And what you'll notice is that they stayed fairly consistent in their overall performance. They didn't do any worse, and then they also didn't necessarily show any improvements. So as you can see, pretty similar performance from both the pre-testing and post-testing for that individual. And so here we have a video of a participant from the intervention group, and this is on their from their pre-testing. And a particular area that Jessica and I definitely saw a lot of improvement upon was in their balances, in their arabesque balances. So we're going to go ahead and just start the video from there so you can notify that difference. So as you can see, that participant kind of fell out of their balance a little bit during their pre-testing. And then you could also notice the level and the height of their leap at the end was also a little bit lower. So now we will watch that same individual's post-testing video also on their right side. And what you'll be able to notice is that they're able to sustain their arabesque balance a little bit longer. And they're also able to get a little bit more height on their leap at the end. As you can see, they had a little bit more extension on their leap at the end. And then also when they came out of their balance, they didn't necessarily fall out of it. They had more control as they were coming down. And so here we have the mean ratings changes between the pre-testing and post-testing from the data that we were able to gather. And so as you can see, the I stands for the individuals that were part of the intervention group, and then the C's at the bottom signify who was in the control group. And so you can obviously see in participants 3, 5, and 7, who were the ones that were in our intervention group, how they were able to significantly increase their ratings on their performance. And so our ratings, when Jessica and I were filling out these evaluations, were on a scale of 0 to 2, 0 being that they didn't do the technique skills such as the leap or the turn. Maybe they forgot it, or they just, had a little mess up, something like that. And then one was that they were able to do the skill, they remembered it, but perhaps they fell out of their turn. Maybe they stumbled on their leap, something like that. They just kind of had a little fluke, but they knew what skill and what step they were supposed to be doing. And then 2 was that they did the step, but they did it significantly well or exceptionally well, like as you could tell from the videos. So maybe they had like longer extension on their leap, maybe they had a longer sustained balance and they didn't fall out of it, something like that. And so that was just kind of the scale and how the ratings went. And so this is the data that we were able to gather from that. And as you can see that in the control groups, most of the individuals or all of the individuals in that group stayed pretty constant in their performance from pre-testing to post-testing week. And so our conclusions and limitations, obviously, if we were able to further conduct and pursue this research, we would love to have more participants just so we could have more data to obtain and gather more information from. But obviously I was in person and Jessica was virtual, so it was kind of difficult to manage more participants with our just in individual situations. Also, maybe having an access to an additional third party to help us evaluate the participants' performance definitely would have been useful, maybe to avoid any possible biases or any conflicts of interest when obtaining those evaluations. And then we also had some unexpected circumstances throughout the semester, just with COVID-19 and some individuals having to quarantine. So then we had to conduct interventions via Zoom. We also had some inconsistent space conditions, just depending on which dance studios were open. So as you could see in some of the videos, we had to have our participants face away from the mirrors just so we could avoid any conflicting visual feedback in the intervention groups. And then also we had one participant that was injured during our study. So obviously we weren't able to use their data. And then weather just affecting the timeline of everything and making it just like a shorter period to conduct this study. We hope that our research can provide some helpful information to dancers and dance teachers in regards to an effective approach to feedback, and perhaps just exploring this new realm of video feedback, especially with the influx of technology in school and all things like that. So, and these are our resources, once again, that we utilized and based our study off of, and that inspired us. So thank you for listening to our presentation, and we hope you enjoyed it.
Howdy, my name is Emily Bolin, and I'm here with my colleagues Betsy Riddle and Elena Johnson. We are all seniors in the Texas A&M University Dance Science program, and we have completed a research project for our dance wellness class. Our research was titled "The Effects of Cues on Overall Aesthetics of Performance in Collegiate Dancers, Looking at Verbal Cueing for Technique versus Positive Self-Talk."
Thank you. Next slide. We actually have no financial conflicts to disclose.
Next slide. The purpose of our study was to decipher if positive self-talk cues or movement technique cues was more beneficial for a dancer in their overall aesthetic and confidence in dance. A question we were asking ourselves was, how can we improve the traditionally negative mindset of dancers in a technique class?
Next slide, please. The previous research for this study did not have a lot of research looking at the positive self-talk specifically on dancers. We were able to find one study that did look at this correlation, and they were able to look at educating dancers and giving them tools to build their own positive self-cueing techniques. The 2 other studies that we found looked at athletes and their self-talk and their positive self-giving cues themselves. One study found that the athletes gave themselves self-talk cues the most when they were in the venues that their sports were performed at.
Next slide.
So for this research, we had 4 participants in 4 different groups. We had a control group that did not do any intervention. We had another group that was movement technique cues. We had a third group that was positive self-talk cueing. And then our 4th group was combined cueing. So they got both the movement technique cues and the positive self-talk cues. Our intervention was 5 weeks long, and we met twice a week with our intervention groups for 15 minutes about each time. So for pre-testing, all 4 participants participated. We taught them a warm-up that stayed standard throughout the research. They were taught a short movement phrase, and this movement phrase was videoed on both sides. And then they did a little written survey that looked at if they knew what self-talk was, how often they used it, and how high their self-confidence was while they were dancing. And then during intervention with those 3 groups twice a week, we did that standard warm-up every time. They were given their cues by a researcher individually, and then they got to perform that movement phrase once with music. And then for the post-testing, they again did the warm-up. We videoed that that movement phrase, and they did that written survey again. And they were asked to think about all of the cues that they had learned in those 5 weeks. And then during those intervention 5 weeks, each researcher, there were 3 researchers and 3 intervention groups. So we were able to rotate around so there was more consistency in their instruction each week. Next slide. So some examples of some of the movement technique cues that we gave the movement technique group and the combined group were they have a little develop a tilt. So we asked them to keep their shoulders down during that. And they were also asked to think about their gaze and where their focus was during their movement so that it could follow continuously as they moved. And then positive self-talk was a little bit different. A lot of people don't even know what self-talk is. So we wanted to focus on educating them in what self-talk actually is. And then we asked when they use it, just to kind of get them to acknowledge their usage of it. And then we tried to shift it towards, well, what are you actually saying towards yourself? Let's try to shift that towards, instead of saying, oh, I messed up, I'm the worst, let's say, okay, I made a mistake. What can I learn from that? It's okay, I'm still learning. I can improve, and try to shift that more positively rather than whatever negative self-talk they may have been using. Next slide.
These are photos from our combination cueing group. So this individual received both the self-talk cues and the movement cues. Like Betsy said earlier, this was an example of the tilt this individual needed to perform. So focusing on the head, looking down towards the fingertips, and also if the leg height, if the student was critical of the height, encouraging them to be excited and ready to improve with practice.
Next slide, please.
So these photos show our participant that was in our positive self-talk intervention group. So this participant only received cues that led them to develop their self-cueing techniques. So this dancer would have been using her own technique knowledge that she had, and we would be giving her cues that would tell her, like Betsy said, this is okay, I can do it again. If she messed up in her week-to-week intervention, that it was not a problem, she could continue to learn and continue to develop her own techniques through a growing positivity in her self-talk.
Next slide. So these are some of our results from the technique scoring assessment, which we took from the pre-test video of the movement phrase and the post-test video. We had one researcher use a scoring sheet just for consistency, so there were no differences as in regard to which researcher was scoring. So as you can see, the combination cueing group that got both sets of cues and the movement technique cueing group showed the most improvement as far as their technique went in those phrases. Next slide, please.
This next graph shows the results from the confidence survey that we gave. It shows that the combination group and the positive self-talk group had the most improvement in their self-confidence.
Next slide, please. The conclusion for this study is that different verbal cues during a dance class can benefit both movement technique and self-efficacy. This conclusion can be of benefit for both a dance educator as well as a dancer themselves learning about their self-talk
techniques and the positivity that they bring into the classroom. Some limitations of this research would be the number of participants. Since we are a small research group, we wanted to have a small number of participants. That's so we could focus on giving them individualized feedback and focus on their cues that were given each week. Another limitation was the short period of intervention. Since this study was completed during a semester, we did not have a very long time for intervention as we were writing our introductions and finishing up the study. So we would have preferred to have a longer time for intervention. There was also a storm in the middle of our study and we were unable to conduct our intervention for that week. Another limitation was the difference in the technique levels of our participants. We did not have a question set aside for what technique level our participants were here in the dance science program. So the classes that they were taking during the week, 3 times a week, were of different levels. And this is not something that we looked into.
Perfect. Next slide. So in the future, obviously through this research, we saw improvements with both movement technique cueing and the positive self-talk cueing. So those positive results, we want to know how we can better apply those. How can we best combine both of those different cues in the most efficient way during a technique class and in the least overwhelming way, since we're asking dancers to think about more than just their technique. Now we're adding another element. So we want to know what's the best way to integrate both of those ideas.
Next slide. Lastly, these are our references that we use throughout our research. Thank you guys for listening.
Howdy, my name is Carissa Weaver.
And I'm Megan Wiemeyer.
And we are seniors here at the Texas A&M Dance Science program, and we got the opportunity to study the effects of a traditional ballet bar versus a modified ballet bar on flexibility, ankle stability, abdominal strength, and endurance in collegiate dancers. So we were interested in studying this because of the growing knowledge of dance science and that shift towards prioritizing the individual physical health of the dancer. And the whole purpose of dance science is to try and prioritize that while still preserving the history of the art. And ballet has not adapted very well to this. We got to look into the history of ballet class and why it is structured the way that it is. And we found 2 main reasons why the order of the ballet class is the way that it is. The first one is just the ability to teach young dancers. It was structured in a way where teaching the dancers would make most logical sense to these like children, in like starting with pliés, going to tendus and then dégagés, and like how to best teach them the positions and correct alignment. And the second reason that we found was preparing for the movements later in the class. So we know that ballet generally starts out, we are doing like pliés and tendus, and then that eventually leads into développés and then adagio and center, and eventually like petit and grand allegro at the end of class. And so this like structure was so that it could be prepared, the movements at the beginning of class could prepare for the end of class. So we wanted to look at what it would look like to intersect this specific dance science research with that history of a ballet class structure. So the 3 areas that we wanted to look at was adding a dynamic warm up to the beginning of class, which means increasing your heart rate about 50 to 60%, which would put you at about a light sweat. And then mobilizing the joints and doing dynamic stretching, which only lasts for about 6 seconds. We also wanted to remove the ballet bar completely because most of ballet and performance is done in the center without a ballet bar and on a stage. And lastly, static stretching at the end of class. Static stretching is stretching for longer than 15 seconds. This is how long it takes for your fascia to acknowledge that you're stretching and to actually be involved in that stretch, rather than the usual 8-count stretches that I found in ballet growing up, and that we found is in the structure of a traditional one of just an 8-count stretch and then moving on. And we also found that static stretching reduces power. And so it is confusing how that happens in the middle of class when jumping, which requires power, happens at the end of class. So if we were to move that static stretching to the end of class, it would no longer reduce power in our jumps, and would actually acknowledge the stretch when it's being done for 15 seconds. So we wanted to prioritize both the health of the individual dancer and the history of ballet in this dance science ballet bar, and we ought to look into the effects of that on hamstring flexibility, ankle stability, and abdominal strength and endurance.
So our study consisted of 6 female college dance students that ranged from the age of 20 to 22, and they took part in an 8-week intervention that was part of a 10-week research analysis. These participants were included in the study because they were dance students at Texas A&M. They were not currently enrolled in any ballet classes. They were not, they had not been injured in the back, hip, ankle, or knee, and they had reliable internet connection since the intervention was done on Zoom. Pre-testing consisted of a warm-up, 4 tests looking at flexibility, ankle stability, and abdominal strength and endurance. So the first test was the modified sit and reach test, and it measured hamstring and lower back flexibility. Dancers sat with their backs against the wall and their feet and arms stretched out in front of them. A mark was taken where their fingertips ended, and they leaned forward as far as they could. And then that measurement was taken from the original position. The second test that was done was a plantar flexion repetition test, and it measured ankle stability and endurance. The dancers had 1 foot in coupe and then releved on the other foot, and we looked for any pronation or supination. Once the dancer did that, then they had to stop, and the number of releves that they had done was recorded, or they were stopped at 25 releves. Pre-testing, the plank hold test was our 3rd test, and the rectus abdominis and transverse abdominis strength was measured. Dancers held the plank position with their neck all the way to their heels, all in line. If they dropped alignment, meaning that their shoulders moved out of alignment or their hips dropped or were above the alignment, then they had to stop until they couldn't hold it anymore. The fitness gram Acrylic test was the last test that we did, and it measured the rectus abdominis and transverse abdominis endurance. It's like a normal curl up, however, the fingertips start position, they had to then reach 4.5 inches further from that starting position. They did this until they messed up twice. So they were given a warning, and then if they did not reach the distance again, then they had to stop. Intervention. The participants were broken up into 3 different groups that had 45-minute classes once a week. The first group was the traditional ballet bar. They remained at the ballet bar for the entirety of the class. They started with pliés, ended with grand battements, and then they had a static stretching in the middle of class. The Dance Science Ballet bar remained in the center for the entirety of the class. They started with a warm-up and then ended with a static stretching. The control group had no intervention and continued with their daily activities. Post-testing also consisted of a warm-up and then the 4 tests that were conducted during the pre-testing. Results. So the results, the traditional ballet bar for the sit and reach test increased. So did the control group. However, the Dance Science Ballet bar actually decreased in their averages of the sit and reach test. The plantar flexion test, the traditional ballet bar increased on the right foot while decreasing on their left foot. The control group actually increased significantly on their right foot and slightly on their left foot. And then the dance science group increased on their right foot and then stayed consistent with the number of releves that they were able to accomplish on their left foot. The plank hold and fitness gram tests, the traditional ballet bar actually decreased in the amount of time that they held their plank as well as the number of curl-ups that they were able to do, while the dance science increased with the amount of time that they were able to hold the plank, as well as the amount of curl-ups that they were able to do. The control group, however, decreased in the time that they held the plank, and then increased the number of sit-ups that they were able to do.
So here's our discussion and conclusion. So as Megan was saying, we found a correlation between the Dance Science Ballet bar and increased abdominal strength. And we think that this is from the center ballet bar. We see that the Dance Science Ballet bar improved on their ankle or their abdominal strength and endurance, and the traditional ballet bar actually declined on their abdominal strength and endurance. And so we believe that removing the ballet bar required the dancers to stabilize through their abdominals more consistently throughout the entire class, rather than having that ballet bar to hold on to stabilize themselves. And so this increase is more what it would look like in a ballet performance. And so we believe that removing the ballet bar and just adding these dance science modifications would increase the abdominal strength of these ballet dancers. And for our COVID-19, we know that the intervention was done over Zoom, and it also restricted the number of participants that we were able to have. When we originally had this research idea, it was before COVID-19 happened. And so we had to adjust our intervention to be able to be done in the middle of the pandemic and be able to have ballet classes over Zoom. We know that this is not ideally how ballet classes are done. Usually they're done in person with hand, like physical feedback and corrections, and usually would involve more participants as well. And so we believe that this could have had possible limitations on our study. Some other possible limitations are the frequency of our intervention. We did a once a week 45-minute ballet bar class for our intervention, and usually ballet is done more frequently throughout the week. And so in our dance science program, we do ballet 3 days a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday. And me growing up, I did ballet almost every day that I danced, which was about 6 days a week. And so we believe that increasing the frequency of our intervention would maybe have affected or given us different results. And lastly, we had a outlier in the control group. She was able to kind of explain what happened throughout the intervention, and she is a teacher and did apply some of the dance science methods that she had learned in her younger classes that she was teaching, and this like affected her results in the control group. So we believe that the significance of our study lies in the future work that can be done based on our background and methods that we have, and also the potential connection between abdominal strength and this dance science ballet bar. Potential research could be done on changing the independent variables that were looked into, reconstructing the entire ballet class rather than just the first portion, which is the bar portion, and lastly, repeating the study with more participants and in person. So these are references that we got to use for our study, and thank you so much for listening.
Thank you.